My brother brought me the coolest gift the other day, a rock. Not just one rock, a bunch of rocks. And these aren't just any ordinary rocks. They have crystals inside. Cool, right? He was hoping these rocks would help inspire a building project, and the first thing that came to mind when I saw them was dragon. And then I immediately thought, wouldn't it be so cool to recreate a miniature version of a dragon? But which one? There's so many to choose from. So I immediately started making a list of all the dragons that came to mind. The first name I thought of was, of course, Haku. And who couldn't forget Falkor? Then there's Shenron, Kaido, and Yehua, the crown prince of the 9 heavens, and my personal conquest, Hulan. And that's just the eastern dragons I could think of. It became clear pretty fast that with all of these great options, I wasn't going to be able to choose just one. So I decided, why not create my own dragon, something unique, something inspired by the rocks. I started this project by going straight to the professionals, the guys at my work, and we decided the first step should be making molds for the scales. Making the molds was pretty simple. We used a mixture of Portland cement, an aggregate, sand is what we used here, and water to bind it all together. I originally wanted to use one of the rocks as the mold for my dragon scales, but since I decided to base my dragon off of an Eastern style dragon, I went in a different direction. According to Chinese mythology, the scales of a dragon are very similar to the scales of a carp. After letting the cement set for a few minutes, I was able to take a flat tool and recreate the shape of the carp scales in my molds. I then let the concrete cure overnight, and by the next day they were ready for use. I started by shaping the base of the dragon using a 1mm bendable aluminum wire. I needed something that would be easy to bend, light, but still strong enough to hold the clay exterior. This aluminum wire did get the job done, but next time I think I would use a thicker wire. The 1mm was a little too flimsy and required lots of layers. I then added painter's tape to sections of the wire to make sure the clay would have something to adhere to. It looks like I'm not the only one super interested in this project, and who could blame him? Dragons are so cool. Did you know that in Chinese mythology, dragons control the weather and the seasons? It's also believed that dragons symbolize prosperity and good fortune. Once those sections were taped, I then added the head to the body using a piece of aluminum wire. Once the head was attached, I used the aluminum wire to secure the shape of the dragon, and then added the final pieces of paper and tape to prepare the dragon for clay. This was my first time using clay since a high school art class, and I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty nervous. I was using air dry clay, so once started, there was no turning back. I decided the easiest course of action would be to break it up into steps. Step 1, start with the belly. Fun fact, a Chinese dragon's belly is said to resemble the shell of a clam, so that's what I tried to recreate. I did try to research some tips and tricks for using clay, and one of the best tips I came across was to score the clay before attaching it to another piece to give it grip and hold, and also to wet the clay. Both of those seem to really work. Step 2 was to add the scales along the back. For this part, I got to bring out my cement molds. I rolled out the clay, pressed it into the mold, and made sure that each piece was precisely added to the back of the dragon. For this part, I used lots of water to make sure it really stuck to the paper. I continued this process until the entire back was covered in scales. I then formed the clay into pointy strips of hair and added that to the lower portion of the mane and the tip of the tail. After a thorough inspection, I moved on to step 3, forming the head. You may have already caught on that the Eastern dragons are made up of a combination of many different animal parts, and the head is no exception. The Chinese dragon is said to have the head of a camel, the neck of a snake, the eyes of a demon, the antlers of a deer, and the ears of a cow. That's a lot of parts, but I was up for the challenge. With this only being my second time using clay, I think he turned out pretty good. As the day came to an end and the clay began to dry, I decided to test a layer of paint before I put the dragon away to dry for the night. The next day, I checked in on my dragon, and overall, it wasn't that bad. As air-dry clay dries, it shrinks, so cracking was to be expected, and I did find one piece of hair that had fallen from the mane, but these small issues are easy to fix. I covered the cracks with my solvent-free sealant and used the same product to reattach the hair. I then used my clay tool and sandpaper to fix any imperfections before I moved on to paint. For this project, I chose to use acrylic paints, specifically gold oxide and warm white. Acrylic paints work really well with air-dry clay. Just make sure you let the clay dry completely before applying your paint to minimize cracking. Also, if you don't use a base primer, be prepared for lots of layering. The clay is porous and will absorb some of the paint, which can lead to a patchy finish, but that can all be fixed with multiple layers or starting with a priming base layer. I started with the dragon's belly, painting a solid layer of gold oxide. To lighten up the belly, I continuously added warm white to my gold oxide paint mixture in between each layer. I really like the way it turned out. A couple people told me that the belly actually looked like a spinal cord, and I thought that was a really cool visual, and I completely agreed. Next, I moved on to the scales, doing the same layering technique with the same colors. As a reminder, my goal was to match the paint on the dragon as close as possible to the quartz in the rocks. I even added a fun greenish blue strip across the back of the dragon to mimic the dark strip in the crystals of the rock. If I was to make another dragon, I would definitely make it all that blue-green color. I loved it that much. Speaking of color, the color of a dragon in Chinese mythology holds a lot of symbolism. A couple examples include red, representing luck and good fortune, black, representing evil or revenge, white, symbolizing purity and virtue, yellow, representing wisdom, good fortune, and power, gold, symbolizing wealth, prosperity, strength, harvest, and power. Comment below which dragon you would choose. I would think my dragon would fall under the gold category because of the gold oxide paint, but to me it looks more of a mix of red and white. Next, I moved on to the final step of molding the clay into a dragon, making the arms and foot. And yes, I said foot, not plural. This part was hard, and you weren't going to see that other foot anyways. I formed the basic structure out of the aluminum bendable wire and then began to add the clay. It is said that Chinese dragons have the paws of a tiger and long claws that resemble the talons of a hawk. So that's what I tried to recreate here. The visual characteristics of Eastern dragons are very similar across the different cultures, but one way to tell them apart is by counting the number of claws. Chinese dragons traditionally have 5 claws, Japanese dragons have 3 claws, and Korean dragons have 4 claws. Interestingly, there is a disagreement on where the dragon originated from and is explained in mythology by the number of claws. It is said in Chinese mythology that the dragon originated in China, and the farther it traveled away from the mainland, the more claws it lost. And in Japan, they believe the exact opposite. The further the dragon traveled from Japan, the more claws it gained. The final arm was a little tricky. I had to make sure it was sturdy enough to extend out from the body instead of resting on the belly. While the arms and foot dried, I moved on to making a lotus out of clay to complement the final design. After the arms had dried for a while, I added a test layer of gold oxide paint and then put everything away to dry overnight. Once the clay was fully dried, I did find a few cracks, but that was to be expected and was easily fixed with the solvent-free sealant and sandpaper. Once the final layer of paint was dry, I sanded down the area where I was going to place the arm and used a Super Duty glue for the final attachment. Moment of truth. Success! I repeated that process with the foot and added a few last touches of paint. Lastly, I covered the clay with a glossy varnish to seal and protect the final design. This gave the dragon a shiny, wet appearance, which is exactly what I wanted. While the dragon fully dried, I started on the base. I used a small hacksaw blade to form the styrofoam into the shape of a pond. Here you can see why I don't normally film this process. It's super messy. Next, I used a heat gun at a very low setting to flatten out the basin and smooth the edges of the rocks. I would strongly advise against attempting something like this unless under direct supervision of a professional and using the proper safety equipment and materials. Once I was done forming the pond, I covered the exterior with my solvent-free paintable caulk. I mainly focused on the perimeter. I had a special technique I wanted to try for the basin. I recently came across this technique where you combine a liquid glue with water and apply it over toilet paper to create the texture of the surface of a body of water. I thought it sounded like a perfect opportunity for this project. I chose to go with Mod Podge as my liquid glue. The liquid glue also acts as a sealant, which will be perfect for painting later. Does anyone else find the smell of Mod Podge really nostalgic? Overall, I think this technique was a success, especially around the waterfall where I was really able to make it look like the water was flowing over the edge. Now I just have to let everything dry and then I can move on to paint. I started by mixing burnt umber with titanium white to create the perfect color for the rocks around the pond. Next, I started on the exterior edges of the pond with a moss green and slowly worked my way inward to a storm blue to create depth within the pond. While I waited for the paint to dry, I felt like something was missing in the pond, so I decided to create lotus leaves out of the leftover clay and some skewer sticks I had randomly around the house. And it was just what the pond needed. Once all of the lotus leaves were in place, I touched up the paint and then added that glossy varnish to give the leaves that wet, shiny appearance. Next, it was time to add the epoxy resin to the interior of the pond to make the water more realistic. This was my first time using resin, so I used the instructions that came with the package. I mixed a 1-to-1 proportion of epoxy resin to epoxy hardener to get the correct consistency and then poured it slowly over the pond. Once the resin cures, we can finally assemble the final design. I am truly impressed with how well this dragon turned out. The only thing left to do now is to enjoy the totally epic video montage. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you truly enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe for more videos just like this one where I build fantastical designs based on what inspires me next. It can be anything, but that's the fun of it.